I'm going to just quickly do an introduction for Professor Harvey J. Alter. First things first, Professor Alter, thank you so much for joining us today at the CCIR Student Symposium. Professor Alter is an American medical researcher, virologist, physician, and Nobel Prize laureate, best known for his work that led to the discovery of hepatitis C. This is the work that eventually led him to win the Nobel Prize in physiology or medicine in 2020, after he received recognition for his research leading to the discovery of the virus that causes hepatitis C. He was also awarded the Distinguished Service Medal, the highest award conferred to civilians in the United States government public health service, and the 2000 Albert Lasker Award for clinical medical research. With that short introduction, I'm going to hand things over now to Professor Alter to discuss a little bit about his research and his life in science. Professor Alter, feel free to take it away.
Okay, thank you, Oliver. I'm sorry I'm not there in Cambridge. I love Cambridge, but I couldn't make it. But anyway, my introductory slide here, my title slide, pretty much tells you what I'm going to talk about. That's the main part. We've made remarkable advances in hepatitis C, and now can really cure anybody who has the infection, but it's been a long story. So it begins, first of all, I want to say that if you understand why pizza is made round and packed in a square box, but eaten as a triangle, then you will understand my lecture today. It's not going to be very complicated. Now, I've spoken to student groups over many years. Sometimes it hasn't worked out so well. But with high school students, I've been impressed with how bright you are at your stage, much brighter than I was. And also your interest in intellectual matters, your interest in the arts, as well as the science. And I took this picture of high school students at a museum to emphasize how engaged you are. And here's your students at the museum with your cell phones. So I hope you don't have your cell phones out today. Now, today I'm going to tell you two intertwined stories. First is the story of my life in a very abridged version. But I think there are some lessons in my life. The main one being that you can make plans, but you may not get what you plan. And what you get may be better than what you planned. So don't be disappointed along the way if things don't work out exactly the way you planned it. My life took very dramatic twists and turns, all of which turned out to be good. Second, I'm going to talk about the life and the possible death of the hepatitis C virus. And we'll get into that in some details. So according to my life, I was born after the Great Depression, and food was still very hard to come by in my youth. But I made it through. And as a youngster, I grew up in New York City in a very tough neighborhood. And I was forced, well, first of all, I knew very early on that I wanted to be a doctor. I wanted to be a real doctor and have my own stethoscope and see patients. That was my goal from youth onwards. But I was in this tough neighborhood, and I had to join a tricycle gang to survive. But I did survive. This is a picture of me at when I was age 13 at my bar mitzvah. And I show this to point out that pompadour I had in those days, proving that I'm not really bald. I've been a hair donor. Okay. So I went to school at the University of Rochester in upstate New York, undergraduate school. Then I went to the medical school, Strong Memorial Hospital, where I had really wonderful training. I loved both college and medical school. And finally, I did become a doctor, and I got my own stethoscope. And it was then that my life took a twist. I was in my first year of residency at Strong Memorial Hospital when I received this draft notice. In those days, it's 1960s, I got summoned to join the Army. And this, had I gone into the Army, my life would have gone in a totally different direction. But with a lot of help from my mentors and teachers at Rochester, I was able to get to NIH instead, National Institutes of Health. And that led me a little bit into a research career, though I still wanted to be a practicing physician. But I spent 2 years at NIH as a fellow. By chance found an antigen called the Australia antigen, which turned out to be part of the hepatitis B virus. And my mentor, Dr. Brooke Blumberg, at that time received a Nobel Prize for pursuing this finding and showing the link to hepatitis B. But I went into finished my clinical training and did a fellowship at Georgetown Hospital in Washington. And then when I finished my fellowship, I was ready to fulfill my dream of going into practice. I applied to a practice position, a very prestigious one in Washington, and I was rejected. I didn't get that job that would have led me into private practice, which might have been good, but I don't think that would have been the best thing for me. So my boss at the time at Georgetown said, well, you can always go into practice. Why don't you stay here in the faculty at Georgetown, which I did. And after a short time, I realized that I was more suited to academic medicine and gave up my dream to be a practicing physician, though I still saw patients. And that was sort of the background. And after 3 years at Georgetown, I got called back by NIH, and they said, that stuff you were working on as a fellow has proven to be the hepatitis B virus, and it's very important. You want to come back and study that further. So I did. Much later on, when I got the Nobel Prize, I received this congratulatory card. And I think anything I tell you today, this is the most important. It says there is no elevator to success. You have to take the stairs. Stairs go up and stairs go down. So you got to take the good and the bad and keep struggling to get up there. But there is no elevator. You got to work hard through your career, whether it be medicine or something else. So remember this slide. And when I got back to NIH, we started this study. It was a prospective study, meaning we followed the patients from the day they got a blood transfusion through the next 6 months. Follow them closely. First, every 1 to 2 weeks, and then every month for 3 more months. The reason we studied this patient group, these are all patients undergoing open heart surgery. And open heart surgery required, in those days, a heart-lung machine that took 7 units of blood just to prime it. So we received a lot of blood. On the average, about 17 units of blood. So if hepatitis was being transmitted, this was a group likely to get it. And also, they were not immunocompromised. They just had their heart problem, immune competent. So if they developed antibodies, we'd be able to measure them. So they got hooked up to the machine. We saved aliquot of the donor blood. In case something did happen, we could link it back to the donor. We obtained all these blood samples over 6 months, but we didn't have much to measure in those days. The only thing we could measure for hepatitis was the ALT, alanine aminotransferase, an enzyme that is released from the liver when the liver gets inflamed. And we could do the first early test for hepatitis B virus, but that was it. So the key was we saved all these samples in frozen storage, and we could go back to them time after time. So if you do go into research and you do a prospective study, you have to save the samples because technology keeps improving year by year, and you want to go back with the latest tests. So that was the thing. What we found was kind of astounding. Prior to 1970, we found that roughly 30% of patients undergoing this open heart surgery developed hepatitis as measured by these liver enzymes. Now, most of these patients were not sick from the hepatitis. The problem with hepatitis C is not so much the acute phase, but the chronic sequelae that may happen 30, 40 years later, as I'll show you, when patients can evolve into cirrhosis, liver cancer, and liver-related death. So now we had this very high rate of hepatitis, and we weren't sure why it was so high. They were receiving, you've seen those little boxes on top, they were receiving over 17 units of blood on average. A study showed, a study done by John Wall showed that the main reason for this high rate was the source of blood. We were buying blood from other blood banks out of state because we couldn't supply enough of our own. And it turns out that if you received at least 1 unit of these paid donor blood, so-called commercial blood, you had a 51% chance of getting hepatitis. Whereas if you received only volunteer donor blood, it was only 7% chance. So with that knowledge, we went back and we were able to switch to an all-volunteer donor system. And we introduced the first generation test for hepatitis B surface antigen. This was a protein that coded the hepatitis B virus, and what I had found as a fellow. So when we did that, there was this precipitous fall in the rate of hepatitis from over 30% down to just under 10%, even though the amount of blood transfused was still the same, but still high at 18 units of blood. So changing the source of donor blood was the most critical thing that we've ever done. We never had rates this high after that. Can you see this arrow that on my pointer? You can? Okay. So now that was the first step. In 1973, better tests for hepatitis B came along. We went back into these stored samples and found that only about 25% to 30% of the hepatitis was due to hepatitis B virus. Now, there were only 2 known viruses at that time, hepatitis A, infectious hepatitis, and hepatitis B, the serum hepatitis. So now we knew there was some non-B entity that was the predominant cause of post-transfusion hepatitis. In 1975, Feinstein, Kapickin, and Purcell, also at NIH, using an immune electron microscope, found the hepatitis A virus and developed a test for it. These were our collaborators, and I immediately sent them my non-B cases, and turned out not a single patient was hepatitis A. So now we had this new entity, and in a brilliant state of deductive reasoning, we said, well, if these cases were not A and were not B, we'd call this non-A, non-B hepatitis. Now, we didn't call it hepatitis C at that time because we hadn't yet proven it was a virus. And we didn't know if it was, we didn't know how many viruses might be involved. But now we had non-A, non-B. And it was the main cause of post-transfusion hepatitis. The next step was the chimpanzee model. We don't use chimps anymore for ethical reasons, although the chimps did not get sick. In fact, they love being in our studies. And you can see them here lining up to sign their informed consents. But the chimp was extremely valuable, and many felt they should have gotten the Nobel Prize, but so be it. Anyway, with the chimps, we were able to show that we could transmit non-A, non-B hepatitis from patients who had acute hepatitis, from patients who had chronic non-A, non-B, and also from totally asymptomatic people who came in to donate blood. They felt healthy, they came in to donate blood, and yet they were silently carrying this virus. So now we had the chimp. And the next big thing, next step was this patient, Mr. H. Mr. H was a man I got to know very well. He liked to climb mountains and blaze trails. One day while he was up on a mountaintop, he had a cardiac arrest. And he would have died on that mountain had his wife not been with him. She knew how to administer CPR. She saved his life. And eventually, he made his way to NIH. And this slide is a little bit complicated, but not very much so, really. If you follow just the blue curve, this is the ALT levels in this patient after he was transfused on 0.0. He received 19 units of blood. On week 5, his ALT began to go up, and it rose to 2,112. The upper limit of normal is 40. And he was very sick at that time. He was jaundiced, he was nauseated, had classic symptoms of relatively severe hepatitis. But then, in a short time, he got better. The ALT levels came down almost to normal, and he felt well again. I'm not showing you this data, but we have followed this patient. We followed this patient for 30 years. He had 4 liver biopsies, and he had very mild liver disease. It never progressed to cirrhosis or any of the bad outcomes. But many years later, a decade later, in the 1980s, PCR came along. And when we were able to measure the virus itself using a polymerase chain reaction. I don't know how many of you have studied that or studied in the lab, but it's a way of measuring the virus itself, viral RNA in this case. What we found was that on week 1, after the blood transfusion, if you follow now this yellow line, on week 1, there was a little blip of HCV or non-A, non-B RNA. This was the donor virus entering the patient's bloodstream. But then it seemed to get contained But in week 4, the virus began to rise, and it rose and rose up to over 10 million copies, 30 million copies. That was just before his liver began to get sick. So as the virus was replicating in the liver was getting inflamed, the ALT level was going up. And then suddenly the virus somehow got contained, came down, and almost reached baseline again, but didn't completely disappear. As the virus came down, the enzymes came down. We titered this virus in other chimpanzees. So in the end, we had now, from this patient, a titered infectious inoculum, and we had the chimps. So you could then give just 1 cc of that material to the chimp. It would cause hepatitis. Again, they didn't get sick, but we could measure the same enzymes in the chimp. So then you could do something with this. You could take that infectious inoculum. You could do something with it, like treat it with chloroform, which Steve Feinstein did, and show that the infection did not occur. So that chloroform is a lipid solvent. This showed that the virus had essential lipid in its membrane. Then with different filters, we could size the virus. We knew eventually that the virus had to be small, about 30 to 60 nanometers. It had to have a surface coating that contained lipid. We presumed that it would have a core protein, as most viruses do. So even before this virus was ever seen or tested for, anything about it, we knew a lot. We knew it was going to be a small virus. That helped to classify the virus into either these small RNA viruses or possibly a hepatitis B-like virus, but we had a lot of information that it wasn't that. So it was either going to be a totally new class of viruses or small RNA virus, as it proved to be. These small RNA viruses are like flaviviruses. Yellow fever virus is another example of these things. So now during all this time, I was a government employee. And government employees have a bad rap. They're thought to be lazy and just living off the government dole. But I want you to know that I always gave 100% at work. It's just that it had this peculiar distribution. So let's see, today is Tuesday. So this is one of my pretty good days, but not perfect. We tried hard to find this agent, to find a test for this agent, but we couldn't do it. We just couldn't somehow do it using every known technique at the time. Remember now, at that time, PCR was not yet around. But we then studied the virus clinically. What did it do to the patients? So with the liver group at NIH, we biopsied 39 patients. Found that most of them had pretty mild to moderate chronic active hepatitis. Some had what was called chronic persistent hepatitis, a very mild form. But 10% already had cirrhosis when we first biopsied them. 13% had severe chronic active hepatitis that would have become cirrhotic. We then rebiopsied them after varying periods of time, rebiopsied 20 of them. Most of them seemed to improve actually over time, or they were very stable. But 25% progressed to cirrhosis over time as we were observing them. So in the end, we had 8 patients out of 39 who had cirrhosis, or 20%. And that figure has held up. That 20 to 30% of hepatitis C patients get this scarring of the liver called cirrhosis. Not only did they get cirrhosis, but 3 of them died of liver failure. 3 of them had very severe liver disease when they died of their underlying heart disease. So for the first time, we knew now that non-A, non-B was not a benign thing. It was a progressively fibrotic disease that could kill, cause cirrhosis, and lead to liver-related death. So now, while the clinical severity of this disease was becoming evident, we still could not develop a serologic, an enzymatic, a radioimmunologic, or even an early molecular test for this test. And that led me, it was very frustrating. And I led me to write a poem of frustration called I Can't See the Forest for the HBAG, the hepatitis B antigen. It went, I think that I shall never see this virus called non-A, non-B, a virus I cannot deliver, and yet I know it's in the liver. A virus that we often blame, but which exists alone by name. No antigen or DNA, no little test to mark its way. A virus which in our confusion has forced us into mass collusion to make exist just by exclusion. But is it real or an illusion? Oh, great liver in the sky, show us where and tell us why. Send us thoughts that will inspire us. Let us see this elusive virus. If we don't publish soon, they're going to fire us. Well, this poem, which I presented at a national meeting, seemed to have a big effect because very shortly thereafter, the Chiron Corporation in California cloned the non-A, non-B agent. I won't go into the molecular biology a lot. I don't know how much you've had of this in school at this point. But basically, they took serum that was known to be infectious, held it down, any virus that might be there, extracted the RNA, and then cut that RNA up into little pieces, made complementary DNA, inserted that into a phage GT11 expression vector. This is a bacteriophage that would not only carry the genetic information, but would also express any protein that was made. So they infected the phage, they infected E. coli with the phage, let it grow and auger, then put a filter paper over the E. coli, lysed the E. coli, releasing any protein. And then they screened the filter paper with serum that was presumed might have an antibody, although no antibody had ever been found up to that time. So they used people who recovered from non-A, non-B, people who had chronic non-A, non-B. They screened, the story goes, 6 million clones before they found a single clone that was positive. This is a real tour de force. But once they had a positive clone, this is Michael Houghton at Chiron, they were able to re-express, locate it, re-express it. They made a small protein and a bigger one, and then were able to develop an antibody assay. When they had that antibody assay, they came back to me to ask for a panel I had developed, a so-called non-A, non-B panel, that had debunked many other laboratories who claimed to have a test for non-A, non-B. It was a small panel, but it was very tricky in that every sample, in that the known positives had been proven positive in chimp transmission, and the negatives came from blood donors who'd given more than 10 times and never been implicated in hepatitis transmission. Every sample in the panel was present in duplicate, and every duplicate was widely separated in a random manner. So nobody had been able to break this panel, but Chiron broke it perfectly. They found their antibody to non-A, non-B, which they were now calling hepatitis C, in 3 patients in 6 different random positions. They found an antibody in 2 implicated blood donors and 4 random positions. They did not find it in 2 patients with acute non-A/non-B because they were looking for antibody and the antibody had not yet developed. But later on, these 2 patients seroconverted for the antibody. And importantly, they didn't find it in any of 7 negative controls in 14 different positions. They hit the panel perfectly. And then I looked at 15 of our non-A, non-B cases, found that in 100%, they were antibody negative before transfusion, became positive at an appropriate time after transfusion. And then we tested the blood donors to 25 of these cases and found that in 80% of the cases, we found a donor who was positive for the virus. So an asymptomatic blood donor who nonetheless tested for this antibody. And by a later test, a better test, 88% became positive. So we can then assume that if we introduce this antibody test to blood donor screening, we might prevent near 90% of post-transfusion hepatitis. And indeed, that's what happened. I showed you this early part of the slide, but I want to concentrate now here. Over the years, we did different interventions. We tested the donors for ALT, we tested them for HIV, and it didn't seem to make any difference in the outcomes. In 1987, we introduced a test for hepatitis B as a surrogate marker for non-A, non-B, and that seemed to drop the rates from 4.1%, from 6% down to 4%. You see, the amount of blood being given was also decreasing. This is why the rates were coming down. Introduced the first generation test for hepatitis C in 1990. Rates came down to 1.1%. 92 introduced a better test, and the rates came down to 0.3%. And by 1997, we reached virtual zero. It's estimated that in the US, by extrapolating these numbers from this chart back to the entire US population, we could estimate that in the 2 decades from 1970 to 1990, blood may have transmitted HCV infection to almost 5 million people in the US. And certainly to a like number probably in Europe. And conversely, after we introduced these tests in 1990 and 92, we probably prevented 2.4 million further transmissions in the next 2 decades. So this was really a wonderful outcome. Now, during this time, I was not only a government employee, but I was also married. And at one point, my wife said to me, "You are the answer to my prayers." But then she went on to say, "You are not what I prayed for, but apparently you are the answer." So I like that slide. So jumping from these prospective studies now to hepatitis C as a global problem, there are 70 million people presumed to be chronically infected with hepatitis C, about 5 million in the US, somewhere between 3 and 5 million really. And I would guess somewhere in that same range in Europe. The reason so many people are infected is that when you get hepatitis C, most people cannot clear it. 75 to 85% of infected people become chronic carriers. And this is the population now that is still infected globally in large numbers, and that I'll show you later we're trying to cure. Miraculously, starting in various treatments for hepatitis, starting with interferon, then ribavirin, and then the combination, long-acting interferon, but rates of cure were still very low. But in 2011, HCV specific drugs were developed. These were drugs that attacked unique enzymes within the hepatitis C virus and totally inactivated the virus. With these direct acting antivirals, we can now cure greater than 95% of people with hepatitis C. And really, it's more like near 100%. So we now have these great cures. So then the question, we come to the end of the beginning. We detected non-A, non-B. We showed how bad it was in terms of blood transfusion. We showed how we could clean up the blood supply using various donor screening assays. Chiron discovered cloned the virus, and then we had these wonderful drugs. So we've come a long way, and that can make you say, well, could this be the beginning of the end for hepatitis C? Well, that depends on whether you see the glass as half full or half empty. I see the glass as half full, meaning that given how effective and safe these treatments have no side effects, we could potentially eliminate hepatitis C globally with a test and treat strategy, meaning you test everybody, find out who's positive, and you treat them to cure. It's not as easy as all that because the tests are expensive. Find the people to find the people, test them. It's complicated, but it can be done. The reason why hepatitis C can be eliminated, as opposed to some other things, is because there is no non-human reservoir. There's no mosquito vector, no tick vector, no animal that's harboring this virus. It's just human to human transmission. So if we could block the human to human transmission, we could get rid of this. We have very sensitive diagnostic assays that keep getting better. And now they're point of care. You can test them. You don't have to go to the main lab. You can test them right on site. And we have these curative treatments. So all of these mean that these 60 to 70 million people globally might eventually be cured. Unfortunately, there are still cases occurring, about 1.5 million cases annually, of which 290,000 die annually. So it's still a problem. But Egypt is the model of what can be done. Egypt had a very high rate of hepatitis C due to an infected vaccine that they had given over the decades to prevent schistosomiasis. So about 5% of the population was infected. The government went to the company that was charging, the US company that was charging, or a European company actually, that was charging $24,000 to cure a case of hepatitis C. And Egypt said, we can't pay that much. Can we get around the patent and make our own drug? The company said yes. They made their own drug. They could make it for $3 to cure somebody. They sold to the Egyptian government for $10. And Egypt said, well, at $10 a cure, we can afford that. And they miraculously, they tested 16 million people, almost the entire Egyptian population. They found that 5% had antibody, 4% had the virus. They treated those 4%. They treated over 2 million people, RNA positive. They cured 98.6% of them at a cost of $50 to $120. The cost not so much for the drugs, but for setting up the infrastructure to test people, etc. So it's just wonderful where we have come. I'm spending my time now trying to eradicate this disease around the world. Europe is doing very well in treating people. The U.S. doesn't yet have the Egyptian model, but we're trying to get that for us. Egypt is providing drugs to other African companies at very low cost. We're trying to work our way down Africa. So I have now reached the golden years. The golden years are not really so golden. As you can see by what happened to Superman when he reached the golden years, or Wonder Woman when she reached the golden years. Uh, these, these are not so great, but it's given me a new philosophy on life where I plotted my perspective of life versus age. So I have age plotted on the abscissa. The ordinate is potential. And this is me out here. I have used up my potential. But this is you over here. You are just starting out. You have all this possibility in front of you, all this great potential in science, in medicine, in other sciences, or whatever career you choose. You're just at the beginning, and it is great. Medicine, I find, was particularly great and exciting field, but every field can be great. Uh, so remember the steps. Remember, there's no elevator. Work hard, stay interested, and I love this slide. Show wonderment. This child watching a hedgehog with intense interest in her eyes. Show wonderment. Get excited about what happens around you. Get excited about whatever job you're in. And when you get down, think about this hedgehog and this little girl. It's it's wonderful. So I want to end with another little poem too. It's been great hanging out with you. I'm sorry again that I'm not in Cambridge. But when I won the Nobel Prize, I wrote a poem which said, I never had no Nobel dreams. And I can't, it's a long poem, I can't read you, but I'm going to read you my high school part from it in the ending. And I said, high school was unauspicious. I mixed with the mob, did nothing suspicious. I was small for my age and basically shy. I could have been a model for Catcher in the Rye. I was not voted most likely to succeed, but there was already a hint my hair would recede. When I graduated high school, I gave no speeches. There was no sign that one day my deeds might exceed that of my teachers. Nothing about me was the fodder for memes, and certainly I never had no Nobel dreams. But now my Nobel dream has unfolded. With new credentials, I'm suddenly emboldened. 1,000 congratulatory emails my computer uploaded. But for Nobel aspirations, I was not truly molded. I expect any day Karolinska will have annulled it, and I will be the first laureate to have their medal ungolded. To have the King of Sweden say, from altar we best hold it. Get the medal back before he has sold it. This award has given my life a massive shakeup. My heart and my mind are having a breakup. Strange forces are scrambling my genetic makeup. Though the leaves of my life, age will soon rake up. I'm happy to be where I am because in life there's no makeup. from this Nobel dream, I'm afraid to wake up. I just want to end with one more little poem that I did not write. I think it's a great poem. It was written by Ralph Waldo Emerson, and he called it Success. Success, to laugh often and much, to win the respect of intelligent people, to earn the appreciation of honest critics, to appreciate beauty, to find the best in others, to leave the world a bit better, to know even one life has breathed easier because you have lived. That is to have succeeded. I wish you guys success and open to questions.
Thank you so much, Professor Alter. We will have 10 minutes for questions and we'll prioritize students. So yes, feel free to come up here and sit in my stead. And feel free to introduce yourself briefly.
Hello, Mr. Alter. I'm Hacken. I'm an aspiring doctor, and I would like to ask whether there's the potential for another hepatitis virus that is still undiscovered.
You know, I don't think so. There's a potential for a lot of things to be discovered, but we've looked very hard for another one, and it looked like hepatitis C has covered the field. That doesn't mean any. There are a lot of viruses that can cause hepatitis, but they're not hepatitis viruses per se. They like cytomegalovirus or Coxsackie virus. They generally cause other things, but occasionally they can cause liver disease. But I don't think there's going to be another one. But I've been wrong before, so I don't know.
Thank you.
I suppose I can ask a quick question, Professor Alter, while people maybe cook on it a little bit. So one of the things that we do here at CCIR is that we're sort of trying to inspire the next generation of researchers as well as scientists. And just a sort of a generic question, but what are some potentially additional words of wisdom that you might impart on students who are considering research and perhaps a little bit daunted by this path?
Yeah. Well, you know, as I wasn't intrinsically a researcher. You know, as I showed you, I really wanted to be a doctor, and I was a doctor. I mean, all these studies were patient oriented, but I could not have done what I done, what our group did, without collaboration. So my first thing about you is you need to find a mentor. You need to find someone whose lab you can start out in, someone who needs you to help their project, but hopefully is not just interested in your hands, but really is interested in fostering your career. So when you're in that first lab, you know, make them proud of you. Work hard, and once you had that sort of background, hopefully publish something, then you get into an academic position or a laboratory, a more permanent position. And again, it's collaboration that's so important. The technology today is so advanced and so complicated and so wonderful, but you can't know it all. Unless you're Albert Einstein, you can't be that smart to understand everything. But you can learn things by collaborating. And you can accomplish things by collaborating. And every collaborator becomes your mentor. And if they see in you that you're working hard, and you're contributing, so you got to give something back in that collaboration. And what you can give back is your work ethic, your enthusiasm, your willingness to do whatever it takes to help the project along. That's how you advance, and then you try make presentations. You want to get to be known. One of the problems with young people is that they're forced, particularly if you're going to a foreign country to do your work, you're forced to move from lab to lab. And then you get into one project, and then you go new lab, you may get into another project. But to the extent that you can, try to become an expert in some area that really interests you. Because if you develop and publish, if you develop an expertise and publish on it, then people come to you. They may want your technical ability. They may want samples you've collected. They may want your statistical abilities. They may want whatever you have to offer to their laboratory. And then if you get into a position where you are now an investigator in an academic institution, a government position, commercial position, whatever it is, keep developing that expertise, keep reaching out to other people, keep publishing, keep talking. It's amazing how giving talks, you get to be known. So not just by your work, but by making your work. You can do fantastic work, but if you don't publish it and you don't talk about it, nobody knows about it. That's just the way the system is. So those are my main things. And there's also be persistent. You know, when I was working with Dr. Bloomberg at the beginning, we found this Australian antigen. We had no idea what it was, but he just kept at it, made hypotheses. They didn't work out, made another hypothesis, and eventually pinned it down to what it really was the hepatitis B virus. So when you find something, try to figure it out, something you didn't expect, try to figure it out until you show it's really nothing, which will be often, unfortunately. But you keep pursuing it until you prove it's not worth pursuing anymore. Because the big findings happen serendipitously. You know, you don't go out and say, I want to discover a virus. Suddenly a virus appears and you figure out what it is. So those are my lessons, I think.
Excellent. Well, Professor Harvey, I wanted to just echo some of the points there. And this point about persistence is definitely incredibly important. Just as you were speaking, I suddenly thought of this other thing that Emerson once said, which is that our friends and teachers are really like our apostles and prophets. So very much sort of echoing sort of what you were saying just now about the importance of collaboration. With that, I would just like to invite the room to give you one more round of applause, and thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
This has been a delightful, humorous, and deeply earnest speech that you delivered, and I just wanted to thank you on behalf of CCIR and myself. And thank you so much, Professor Alter.
Okay, thank you. I enjoyed it.